Got my Kissing Dinosaurs t-shirt on because that arrived yesterday. Sebastian Croft, I believe his name is, who played one of the characters in Heartstopper, did a limited edition t-shirt for charity. It's Kissing Dinosaurs and it says "Queer was always here" and I'm a big fan of it. New favourite item of clothing. Anyway. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Kate, I make videos about books and bookish things, and today I am going to be talking about one of my favourite series ever. I briefly talked about it in one other video, I think, in which I talked about general childhood favourite series, but I'm giving this one its own video because this is the favourite childhood series, I think, for me personally, and I just want a chance to talk about it. The series in question is the Ruby Redfort series by Lauren Child, which I discovered shortly after the first book came out in 2011. When I was 9 years old, which means that this series has been around for more than half of my life at this point, which is a little bit overwhelming to think about. I have now lived more of my life with this series in it than I have lived without it. I genuinely believe this is one of the best children's series ever, and yes, I am incredibly biased. This is something that I have loved for, as I say, more than half of my life, and I genuinely think it has a significant amount of merit, and this isn't just me being biased because it has been such a big part of my growing up, of my childhood, of my teenage years. So I'm going to talk about it. The Ruby Redfort series is, of course, about a teenage spy named Ruby Redfort who, when she is 13 years old, is spotted by the spy agency Spectrum. They've been observing her for many, many years, and finally time has come where they have no code breaker. Their previous agent, Agent Lopez, has recently died under slightly suspicious circumstances, and although they don't exactly like to hire children to do adults' work, they have no other choice, so Ruby Redfort is brought in after breaking a code that leads her to the Spectrum headquarters and is brought on to solve a case. Just the one case, of course, until they decide they actually do want to keep her around. And the 6 books follow her as she works for Spectrum, initially just as a code breaker, but later as she enters their trainee program to become a field agent. And across the 6 books we watch her solve numerous cases for Spectrum and uncover potentially a much larger plot at play to potentially bring down Spectrum as a whole. The 6 books are just fantastic, and I'm going to talk at length about all 6 of them and just the world of Ruby Redfort as a whole. I think the first great merit of Ruby Redfort as a series is just the premise. What smart kid didn't daydream about becoming a secret agent, and especially in Ruby's circumstance, to have been essentially talent spotted by a spy agency for many, many years? What I think really sets Ruby Redfort apart from other sort of kids, teenage spy thriller books, though, is the execution of the premise. Ruby Redfort is genuinely smart, and one of the things that I think a lot of kids spy thrillers struggle with is that they are trying to write a child genius, but what they actually do is just write someone who seems like a genius to children. Ruby, it has to be said, clearly punches above the adults that she is working with, and you genuinely believe that she is the only one who can solve a lot of these codes. She is smart, but not just a kid's level of smart. She is smarter than the people she is working alongside, and the books do a really, really good job at convincing you that no one except Ruby has the intelligence and the skill to be able to do what she does. However, on the complete flip side of that, Ruby does just come across as a 13-year-old a lot of the time. It is so easy to write a smart character and have them start to feel a little bit Mary Sue-ish, but Ruby is very, very well-rounded. Yes, she is exceptionally smart, exceptionally talented, and one of the main things that could lead her into Mary Sue territory is that she is very, very quick at picking up on new skills. However, she is also quite arrogant. She has quite an ego, and as the series progresses, this is something that she really has to learn to deal with, is that she isn't always good at things immediately, and that actually it is a good thing that she sometimes needs to think about things rather than being able to dive headlong into them and get them spot on right away. She's reckless, especially from the 4th book onwards. Ruby starts to develop a real miracle complex, as the books put it. She starts to believe that she is invincible, that she knows what she's doing, and that she is smarter than the adults she is working with, which very frequently proves to not be the case. She may be intellectually above them, but she is still a 13-year-old. Her judgment skills are not perfect, and quite a lot of times she has to be pulled out of some nasty scrapes by people who are able to see far enough ahead of her. The mistakes that Ruby makes are very believable because she is a 13-year-old, and so it makes a lot of sense why Spectrum would take her on and why they would see her as such a valuable asset, despite the fact that she causes them so much trouble, because she is an exceptionally smart 13-year-old, but she is a 13-year-old. And additionally, in terms of the execution, so often with these kid spies, they get put into ridiculously dangerous circumstances on the basis that they are exceptional, but the adults often don't seem to take full responsibility of the fact that they are managing a child. Ruby Redford does do this though. From the third book onwards, when Ruby demonstrates that she is an exceptionally reckless agent, LB takes her off the trainee agent program and says, look, you can't be trusted in the field. You're an excellent code breaker and that's where we want to keep you. You can't be on these field agent tasks until you can prove that you are sensible enough and well-rounded enough to be able to take care of yourself in these circumstances. And I thought this was such a good thing to read about in one of these books. So often the kids are let completely loose because, yeah, they're smart or they're talented or they got lucky. But LB and Hitch and all the other agents that Ruby works with make sure she's taking care of herself. Additionally, the real-world consequences of her actions are shown. Ruby gets into a lot of scrapes and gets injured quite frequently, and from the fourth book onwards, we see her parents get anxious about the fact that their kid keeps coming home injured. Ruby, of course, can't tell them what's going on because she is part of a secret agency, but they still see their kid with a broken arm and burns on her face, and they really want to take care of her. So I really appreciated, again, the real-world aspect that appreciated the fact this is a child going into these situations, and any sensible adult that cares about her within a professional capacity or as a family member is not going to let her keep making the same mistakes as she always does. To this extent, I think that is what really makes Ruby Redford an exceptional example of these kids' spy thrillers. She is above and beyond the level that you would expect from a lot of this genre of writing, and it is done perfectly. That is on the very individual basis of each book, of course, has an episodic, here is the case, here is the bad guy, here is Ruby working through it and getting to the end point. But there is a through narrative that follows each of these 6 books as well, in which Ruby starts to realise that perhaps all these cases she's been working on may not be as separate as she first thought, and that actually Spectrum as an agency may not be as perfect and carefully put together as she first thought as well. The through narrative, I think, is what really brings all of these books together, because it keeps you wanting to read each new story. Yes, you want to read about Ruby being a cool code breaker, you want to see what's going on with her friends, but as you start getting to know the recurrent villains and the recurrent issues that are popping up for Ruby, you start to want to know what is the bigger picture that these are building into, and it is what keeps you wanting to read each of these 6 books. I recently found out that Lauren Child was actually brought into a 6-book deal for Ruby Redford. Ruby Redford actually wasn't an original series. Lauren Child, of course, wrote the wildly popular Clarice Bean books, which I never read, but in Clarice Bean, the character of Clarice Bean reads the Ruby Redford series, and readers of the initial series wanted to know what Ruby Redford was, and so Lauren Child was brought into a publishing deal and made Ruby Redford a reality. However, because this was initially a 6-book deal, I think that this meant Lauren Child could plan these books ahead in advance enough that she could put together this really, really complex and well thought through narrative that makes it a really, really rewarding series to come to. A lot of books that end up as incidental series don't have this same level of cohesion throughout them, and so there's a lot of really, really clever foreshadowing from the very, very first book that leads into the final book that simply wouldn't have been possible without this foresight to know there's going to be another 5 books after this. The series expands very, very naturally from the off point. Of course, it begins very simply as teen codebreaker, what will she get up to next? But it very, very quickly expands into what is the history of Spectrum as an agency? What is going on behind the scenes that Ruby hasn't yet been let into? How much can she trust these people that she has only just started to get to know within a couple of months? And it makes it very, very engaging and rewarding to then continue so that you can get to unveil this bigger picture as Ruby does. Speaking of engaging with the series, one of the things that I adored as a kid when I read these books was there is a level of interactivity to them. Ruby and her best friend Clancy leave each other coded notes up a tree that they visit, and so these notes are given in the books themselves in code. You are given the key to them so that you should be able to solve them yourself in theory, but it does mean there is some real code breaking for you to do that is feasible, because I've done it. And there is a website set up so that you can actually put in these codes, stick in the keyword, and solve them. But it was just such a cool thing as a kid to be able to do a little bit of what Ruby did and to feel included as well in this really great friendship that she and Clancy have. Coding, of course, is a massive part of this series because it is what Ruby was first employed at Spectrum to do. While the code in the first book can stand very much on its own as just a code that Ruby breaks, from the second book onwards it becomes very, very clear that there is a thematic element to each of these codes. And the theme is the senses. Going back to what I said earlier about Ruby genuinely being a child genius rather than just seems like a genius if you're a child, one of the things Lauren Child did in the writing was work with an actual code breaker to write these codes. Actually, I don't know if he was a code breaker, but he is a genuine professor and someone who really, really knows what he's talking about. And she worked with him in order to design the codes so that they were something genuinely clever and cool and hard to break. And I think this is what really, really gives Ruby Redfort its edge, is that the codes are genuinely really cool and really, really smart. Alright, now I'm just going to talk about the characters for a bit. I feel like I've talked a lot about what makes up the series in terms of its component parts, what makes it so great, but I think the thing that really gives this series its life is the characters and the world. So let's just talk about some of the characters first of all. Ruby Redfort herself. Ruby is perfect to me. She is the perfect character, she is the perfect protagonist as well, and I think it is a very, very rare thing in children's books, especially with a fairly large ensemble cast, for the main character to be people's favourite. She is very, very deserving of her place as protagonist. There is no one better situated to be the person telling this story than her. And she is just so engaging and entertaining. She is whip smart, she is sarcastic, she is funny, and she is generally just a really, really likeable character too. She could easily come across as too aloof or too sarcastic, but instead it comes across as a really, really warm and engaging part of her personality. And you understand why she is so popular among her friends and her colleagues and all the different people she interacts with throughout the series. Speaking of characters that like Ruby, Clancy, her best friend. Firstly, I have to say, the thing that delighted me most when I read these for the first time is that Ruby and Clancy don't end up in a romance by the end of the series, which I was so, so grateful for. It could have so easily been done, you know, main female character, main male character, make them a relationship, but Lauren Child did not do that. She just made them the bestest of best friends, and it is perfect. Clancy is your average, like, best friend, scrawny, a little bit useless, a little bit weedy and nerdy, but he's not just that. He is just as clever as Ruby is. He is just as intuitive. And if anything, that is the one thing where he manages to beat Ruby every single time. He often gets hunches, and this is something that gets referenced a lot throughout the series, and if Ruby is uncertain of something but that Clancy has a hunch about, she will listen to him and he is always right. It is a really, really cool thing to have clever characters that are able to bounce off each other in the way that Ruby and Clancy do, and it absolutely fleshes out Ruby more to have a friend like that she can bounce off. But he is also just so endearing in his own way. Clancy is a really, really likeable character. Despite him not being as impressive as Ruby, he still comes across as just as funny and welcoming and warm, and he has my entire heart. I would die for this scrawny little 13-year-old. One of the best things about Ruby and Clancy's relationship, I think, is the fact that they do have some issues as well. They have some very, very real friendship communication issues that we mostly start to see when Ruby is getting really, really deep into her agent stuff, to the point where she starts to neglect her friends, and Clancy starts getting jealous and upset, and he starts taking it out on her a little bit. And it is so realistically done. These are just 13-year-olds having a little bit of a fight, but you really, really feel for them, and it doesn't feel at all out of character despite the high level of conversation they are normally working at for them to be having these kind of relationship problems, and ultimately they solve them because they are both intensely loyal friends. And it's just adorable. I just love it. I love the fact that these two are such good friends that nothing can pull them apart. The first Spectrum agent that Ruby meets is Hitch, and she doesn't actually meet him at the agency, but he turns up to work as a house manager for her and her parents, and she is initially highly suspicious of this very, very immaculately groomed, handsome stranger who has just turned up in her house and seems very, very perceptive and very good at his job. But she then learns that he's there to be her mentor, to watch over her and to help her with her code breaking, and they very, very quickly become an absolutely iconic duo. Hitch is incredibly clever and perceptive, but he also gives Ruby the benefit of the doubt a lot of the time. They work really well together within a colleague's perspective, you know, they do literally work together, but they also end up with a really, really strong father-daughter bond that is just fantastic to read about. Hitch very, very frequently keeps secrets from their joint boss, LB, because Ruby needs extra time to work on a case, or she's been doing stuff that isn't strictly allowed within the rules of Spectrum, and so Hitch goes out of his way to cover for her, to give her the space she needs to work things through. And he even does things like in the first book when he catches Ruby trying to cycle home rather than letting him drive her home, which is very much what she is meant to be doing given that she is a 13-year-old working on a very dangerous case. But rather than getting mad at her, he apologises for not trusting her enough and says, right, we're both going to be a bit more reasonable about this. You're allowed to get yourself to and from so long as I can track your location to keep you safe. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and don't tell LB I'm doing this. It is just delightful to see how well they work together on every single level, and ultimately he is probably the most likeable of the Spectrum agents just because the banter he and Ruby have is so appealing. Another of the good things about their relationship is just that Hitch really, really cares about Ruby. It starts as a purely professional thing that he is there as her guardian, but he also just likes her as an individual as the series goes on, and you really get the sense that he is doing a lot of things because he likes her as an individual and he wants to take care of her. One of my absolute favourite moments that I'll discuss in detail later is Hitch getting Clancy out of a really difficult spot. He owes nothing to Clancy, but he is Ruby's best friend, and so he goes above and beyond to make sure that Clancy's okay too. Top tier dad friend. And just to talk about some of the broader swathes of characters as well, Ruby's friendship group. They don't feature a huge amount within the overarching plot of Ruby being a secret agent, but the little bits of them that we see throughout her just being a kid, going to school and trying to balance that, they are a fantastic group. Del, Red, Mouse, Elliot, I love all of them and they make such a fantastic ensemble. I just want to be friends with all of them as well. And then the rest of the agents at Spectrum, there are so many that get named and there are so many that you get extended stories for, but there are also a number of just random names that pop up and a couple of very, very minor interactions that are just fantastic. There's so many cool agents in Spectrum and I love all of them, and the picture of this agency as a whole that it paints, that all these different people work together in different capacities, my favourites. As another final group of characters to mention, the villains of Ruby Redford are all so goddamn camp, and I love it. The Count, Lorelei von Leyden, the Australian, even Claude Fontaine, they are all just absolutely fantastic. They are characterised down to the barest essentials and it is perfect. The other thing that really builds up Ruby Redford as a series is the world. The book is set in the fictional Californian city of Twinford in the 1970s, and you get the feeling of this place immediately. The locations that Ruby and her friends hang out in, there are such detailed maps drawn for this in the 6th book, by the way. You can see everywhere they go if you want to, and I very frequently do. But the locations, the description of Ruby's beautiful architect-made state-of-the-art home, the school you get such a good feeling of, places like the mountainside where they go cycling, everywhere in Twinford has such great characterisation to the point where you can feel what this city is like as a place. Also just the 70s vibes. Ruby collects vintage telephones. Ruby likes to wear graphic tees with words like bozo across them. All the slang that they use, everything just comes together to give you a really, really solid feeling of this place, this era, and the people involved in it, so that you get a really complete feeling of where this is all taking place, and it brings it all to life in a way that I don't think could have been done without such careful planning of the places where everything takes place. Okay, I've done a lot of talking already, but I'm not done yet. I now want to talk a little bit about each of the 6 books. There may well be spoilery bits, so if you see a book icon go up with a big red X over it, that means there's about to be spoiler talk, so feel free to skip ahead. I may put time codes on screen as well, but hopefully I should be able to make sure you don't get spoiled. I think I've been very, very good so far at only talking about bare bones or stuff that is very much laid out from the beginning, so hopefully if you are interested and haven't read it yet, you won't have been spoiled, but now I may enter spoilerish territory. The first book, Ruby Redford, Look Into My Eyes. This is just a perfect introduction to the world of Ruby Redford. You get a very, very brief look into Spectrum, you get to meet people like Hitch and LB and Blackout and Froghorn, but it also starts to set up some of the overarching themes, the Count, for instance, as a villain. It's really, really good at just getting you immersed into it and getting the lay of the land, as it were. To that extent, I feel like Look Into My Eyes could kind of work as a standalone, but to be honest, I don't think you can read Look Into My Eyes and not want to read more of them. It sets up the plot structure in such an appealing way that I think it'd be very hard to read it and go, yeah, I'm happy with leaving that there, I don't want to hear anything more about Ruby Redford. Of course you want to read the second book. Book 2, which is Take Your Last Breath, genuinely still creeps me out to this day. When I was rereading it only a couple of weeks ago, I had to leave the final chapters until daytime, even though I got up to them while I was reading in bed, because they're really, really, really creepy. There is a significantly supernatural element to this one. This isn't just, you know, villains being villains, nefarious plans. There is a giant fuck-off octopus that eats people, attacks people, and is a major part of the conclusion of the story. And I don't like the sea, I am quite scared of the sea, and ooh, it is quite intense reading for me even now, but it is so spectacularly done. There is an excellent moment in it in which you hear the Count approaching Ruby as she's hiding, and the little motif that you get given in the first book is that he wears very expensive Italian leather shoes, and the way you find out that the Count has found Ruby out is that she is hiding and she hears the tap 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 of handmade Italian leather shoes across the rock, and it still gives me chills reading it even now. It is such superb writing by Lauren Child, knowing that she has laid out this expectation perfectly so that when we get the big reveal, it's, oh god, oh no. It's immaculate. I love it. Book 3 was my favourite when I was a kid in my memory, not least because the hardcover came with a limited edition bubblegum scented flap on the inside, like scratch and sniff. Ruby chews bubblegum and it is a big part of her character, so to have that in the book where the code is based on scent was fantastic. This is also the one that starts to bring in the idea of Ruby being a little bit reckless as well, which is obviously so important for the overall narrative, and so I generally think it is just a really, really good continuation. However, my current favourite is Book 4, Feel the Fear, because this is the one where you really get the feeling that Ruby is fighting not just against the villains, but against herself and against what she has become in the face of being a secret agent. She has become someone who is so impressive. She has cheated death on 3 separate occasions at this point, and it starts to get to her psychologically. And I thought it was a really, really good way of, again, humanising her at the point at which the series could have very easily become a little bit too formulaic and a little bit, this is a child genius, she can do no wrong, she always manages to get out at the last moment. This is the one where you really start to see that this is taking a really big toll on her ability to be a good agent. And I thought it was a really, really impressive thing to do for the series. Also, just the vibes of this one are immaculate. The case that Ruby is having to solve relates to old Hollywood, starlets, actresses, all the drama that goes on in sort of the 50s movies era, and it is done so well. Additionally, the introduction of Beetle Bailey Roach to really just settle in my mind that Ruby Redford is Arrow Ace. She gets a potential love interest who turns out to be an absolute dick. He bullies Clancy, and so Ruby makes his life hell for him. Absolutely love this one. It is such a good book, and the conclusion of it I think is perhaps one of the most dramatic, which I really, really just enjoy the vibes of. Also, the code is a really, really cool one, and it relates to poetry as well as touch, so you know I'm going to be a big fan of a poetry code. As much as I say that though, Book 5, Pick Your Poison, probably has my favourite of the codes. This is the taste related one, and the way it has been constructed is so just a cool way that I think it has to be my favourite just on that basis. This is also the one where Ruby's doubts in Spectrum as an agency and how much she can trust the people she works with really get cemented, and so I think it is excellent for being the one that really ramps up the intensity of overarching narrative of what is Spectrum here for? What is Spectrum doing? And who is trying to take it down? And then book 6, Blink and You Die. Oh my god, this is the perfect wrapping up of all the loose threads. It is the perfect conclusion. It brings such a satisfying end to the narrative by pulling us back to things like the flashback to when Ruby was 2 years old that is given in the first book, and making that a key part of Ruby's overall involvement in Spectrum is just brilliant. This is the one where we find out the relationships between all the villains, all the potential links between them. It is also where we find out what happened to Bradley Baker, who is a name that has been recurring throughout all of these books. He is the best agent that ever lived that died horribly years before Ruby was around, and his legacy has been one that overarches the entire series of books. So to finally get to the bottom of all that in this book, and in such a devastating way as well, is just fantastic. Book 6 really relies on Ruby's instinct, her ability to trust, to make judgment calls based on her gut feeling, and what it ultimately comes down to is Ruby literally being stranded on a rooftop with 2 people reaching for her hand, and she has to decide which one she thinks is evil and has been plotting against her this entire time, and which one is the only person who can save her. It is just a perfect narrative conclusion to her arcs, and I love it. It's so dramatic. Perfect. It is the ending you want after 6 entire books, and yeah, it is probably the most impressive of all the 6 books, all in all, because of the way it manages to handle just so much material that has been laid out across the 5 previous books. It is immaculate. When I reread the 6th book this time, I wasn't expecting to cry at a big, dramatic, sad scene that I knew was coming, but I did. It got down to it, and even though I knew exactly what was going to happen, I cried. It was really emotional, and one of the things that I don't associate Ruby Redford series with being is an emotional one. It's really well written, but it's not written to evoke emotion in that way. So I was really surprised that actually this portion of the story got to me and made me cry. But I think it is just testament, I think, really to how much I've let it live inside me, that even just the approach to this portion of the story got me in my feelings. And now I'm just going to take a moment to talk about some of the perfect, spot-on, vibey moments in this series that still absolutely delight me even all these years later. In book 4, this is the incident I was talking about before. Clancy's sister destroys the top of his mum's antique dresser, and he's panicking because his mum's about to come home from the airport and discover that everything has been destroyed. So what does he do? He calls up Ruby, and Ruby tells Hitch, and Hitch brings in a team of perfect furniture restorers who sort it all out in about 40 minutes flat. Hitch sprays the room down so they can't smell any of the chemicals used, and just goes on his way. And this to me is the perfect example of the way that Hitch cares so much about Ruby that he is willing to do a massive favour for Clancy, even though Clancy is absolutely nothing to do with him. He also knows that Clancy knows things about Spectrum, despite the fact that the #1 rule of Spectrum is keep it zipped. You don't tell anyone anything about Spectrum if they aren't part of the agency. And Ruby tells Clancy literally everything. So Hitch really goes out of his way to prove himself as the ultimate dad figure, and I love him for it. Another excellent moment in book 5. Lorelei von Leyden, one of the recurring villains, she goes undercover, and the reveal in which they find out exactly who she is spine-chilling. It is the moment in which Clancy smells her perfume and goes, this has to be her. And it has previously been someone who was very, very trustworthy to the group, so it is an excellent reveal, and it gets to me even now. Okay, I'm going to talk major spoilers for book 6. You better click away if you don't want them. The big reveal at the end of who has been the mole within Spectrum, the person who it is who's been leaking all this information and bringing everyone right into Spectrum's centre to destroy them from inside out. There is a lot of imagery throughout book 6 of toadstools, of the idea of something rotten at the core attracting flies to it. Firstly, flies are the logo of Spectrum. Excellent. And secondly, Buzz is described as a mushroom. From book 1, she is likened to a mushroom sitting in a ring of telephones, being the centre of communications in Spectrum, and we only realise that she's been causing all these problems at the very, very end, and then that mushroom toadstool imagery. I was just so impressed by that when I figured it out upon this reread. It is excellent, it is so impressive. And in a similar vein, Book 1, when Ruby finds the code that leads her to Spectrum HQ, she doesn't know what she's being led to. She just gets a cryptic phone call and decides to follow her nose, and it takes her to a manhole cover, and she crawls all the way through to find the Spectrum HQ, and she has a meeting with LB. And Ruby basically starts asking, well, how do I know I should work for you? How do I know you're the good guys? And LB says to her, you wouldn't have crawled here in the dark. You wouldn't have listened to a cryptic phone call if you thought we were the bad guys. And so to then get to the final book where it all comes down to Ruby's gut instinct, who does she want to think the enemy is? Who does she want it to be that she can trust? Spot on. Who would she want to find at the end of that tunnel? It's Hitch, and so of course she trusts him. Excellent. It is again one of those things laying out the themes right from the very, very beginning of the book that I am so impressed with. I am going to take a very, very small moment to talk about a few tiny nitpicks that I have with this series, because there are a couple of them. I don't think it is perfect. Actually, that's a lie. I do think it is perfect. However, I acknowledge that within that there are some things that are perhaps a tad lacking. Firstly, book 6 is quite rushed towards the end. The very, very big reveal over who it is that has been trying to bring down Spectrum from the inside happens within a very, very small number of pages, and then suddenly we are led into the ending where Ruby has to make the final call of who she trusts. If that had been prolonged a little bit more, if more seeds had been sown along the way, I think it could have had an even bigger impact, because I remember reading it at the time and being quite overwhelmed by it. Now, because I know what's coming, because I know what to expect, it reads really, really well, but as a first time reading, it was, ooh, okay, suddenly we are here. There are also just a couple of loose ends that could have done with a little bit better tying up. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I remember immediately after it finished, I kind of went, this still feels like there's a little bit that we have left to unpack, to fully round off here. So I'm just going to throw that out there, even though I can't remember the specifics. Book 3 as well, even though it was my absolute favourite when I was younger, I do think is probably the weakest just from a being really impressive standpoint. By book 3, we're kind of into the structure of Ruby gets given a new case, Ruby starts working on the case, big reveal of who the villain is. There is still more stuff to be learned in the concluding chapter. And book 3, I think, does start to fall a little bit into being quite formulaic. It's still really, really good. I just think if things weren't, you know, shifted up a gear as much as they were in book 4, that it might have started to run out of steam a little bit. But to be honest, these are still really, really small things compared to the overall comprehensive cohesiveness that is this series. It is so expertly put together in such minute, careful ways to bring it into such a satisfying conclusion, but also to make sure that each individual book is really, really engaging on its own. You could easily pick up any one of these, and provided you knew roughly the story going into it, you could still have a really, really good time. These are fantastic books, and I think it's very easy to see why I've continued to love them for so many years. They are just so gripping and enthralling, but also fun. They're just a really good time. Ruby and her friends and the people she works with at Spectrum are so engaging and entertaining. I think it's no wonder that this is still one of the most popular series from my generation when we were kids. Ruby Redfort will forever have my heart, and I can see myself rereading this series well, well, well into my adulthood. It is a true delight, and I think that is finally, I do apologise, the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This is one of those series that I am genuinely so passionate about because I think it does such good things as a set of books, just in terms of giving kids really, really good stories to read. So yeah, I hope it's been interesting to listen to, and that if you have not read this, it makes you want to go read it. Please, I cannot recommend it enough. If you have read it, Let me know in the comments below what some of your favourite moments from the books were. If you're going to go into spoilers, please do flag, just so that people don't have to worry about spoilery stuff. But, you know, there's so many great moments in this series as a whole and in each of the individual books that I'm sure anyone who's read these can come up with 5 off the top of their head. Please do like this video if you enjoyed it, and feel free to subscribe if you want to see more of me and my bookish content. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time.